ideas, some of the pictures that sort of represent some of the main ideas we have about what young women in contemporary British society are like, what they're interested in. So, while young women are currently praised, particularly for their academic achievements, they're outperforming boys at every level of education, they're seen as very bright, they're going to, for a large part, kind of what are seen as good jobs. At the same time, they are often denigrated for being apolitical, for being predominantly interested in practices of consumption, whether that's straightforward buying clothes, buying shoes, buying makeup, and obsessing about these things. Consuming popular culture in terms of being more preoccupied with the X factor, necessarily than maybe parliamentary politics. Problematic kind of moral panics around young women's drinking, and particularly drinking to excess and binge drinking, and the harms that they subject themselves to as a part of that. They're also seen to be kind of obsessed with social media and the internet, constantly taking selfies, obsessing about their image and putting out personal information on the internet. And anyone who has met a young woman knows that obviously that's a very artificial understanding of what really they're about. They're much more complex, just as people tend to be. But yet it tends to be a narrative that is perpetuated, particularly through the media, particularly through the Daily Mail and their horror stories of the things that they've been getting up to, and just kind of general coverage. And my problem with this is that it didn't represent what I saw young women doing and who I was as a young woman. So I really wanted to start interrogating some of those ideas about young women as apolitical, young women as apathetic, and young women as individualist. And one of the reasons for doing that is because I was a young woman who was engaged in politics, who was interested in politics, who was engaged in particularly feminist activism and then more lately kind of environmental and anarchist activism. And these representations from the media didn't fit with what I had experienced. I'd spent time with incredibly strong, empowered, independent young women who looked at the world around them and were dissatisfied with what they saw. But rather than just moaning, they went out into the world and tried to change it. They tried to effect change. But generally, young women's political participation is seen as problematic because of the lack of it, or the perceived lack of it. So we have, some headlines that only take 5 minutes to just do a Google search. And oh look, young women, they're not engaged. And young women are seen as a particularly problematic subset of youth more generally, because youth, young people, are seen as the group that are most disengaged from political processes. If you look back to 2010, you find that fewer than 50% of the young people who are eligible to vote in the general election actually engaged, actually voted. And so there's something of a crisis around young people's political participation. There are constant strategies designed to try and get them involved more. There's the feeling about the need for a citizenship education, to inform people about how to get involved in the political process, how their local councils work, how government works, how they can vote. And we see that kind of right now with particularly ideas around lowering the voting age to 16, and the fact that was done in the referendum for Scottish independence, and debates on either side about the worth, the value of that. And I think it's a particularly interesting time to be talking about that now with Jeremy Corbyn's kind of election to Labour leader, and this groundswell of support that he's received from predominantly young people, and the idea that a new kind of politics might be possible and might enable us to kind of engage young people more to some extent. I didn't get quite thirsty. But we carry on being worried that young people, and particularly young women, because in the academic research they're seen as the ones that are most disengaged. We worry that they're foregoing the legacies of the suffragettes, that women died to get them the vote and that they're not interested and they don't care. But I find these ideas around young women's disengagement, their apathy, quite problematic because they tend to conceive of politics in a very narrow sense. Politics becomes voting in an election, and that's about it. You know, you might also get to vote in a local council election, very exciting. You might write to your MP. But that's a very narrow way of conceiving of what is actually something that runs through our everyday lives, something that affects us on a daily basis. And so while we have headlines about young women's failure to vote, their disengagement, what we don't tend to see so much are the headlines about young women's sense of injustice, their recognition that the world isn't fair, the voluntary work that they do on a large scale, the money that they raise for charities, the conversations that they have with their friends, the books that they read. And all of these are ways of engaging with ideas of politics that this very narrow idea doesn't necessarily recognise. And so just as I was starting my PhD, we had the tuition fees protests in London. And this was one of the most popularly used photographs in the media at that time, particularly in newspapers. This image of a group of schoolgirls in their school uniform linking arms around a police van that had been vandalised. And this was taken as an image of young women's participation, their political engagement. And it was generally treated with surprise, for the most part. They were considered to be exceptional, and therefore noteworthy. And I find this picture really interesting. It has so much to say. You could spend hours deconstructing this. I won't, because that might be a bit dark. But I use this as something to come back to, because while we have narratives of young women's political participation as exceptional, actually, for most women, it's much more kind of commonplace, perhaps not in the spectacular sense that we see here, but in an everyday sense. And so this is what I was much more used to. These were the young women that I was spending time with, and I was disappointed that their voices weren't being heard. So my research set out to look at what makes young women different who are participating in this form of politics. How do they get to do this? How are these young women different from the ones who are staying in on a Saturday night to watch the X-Files? The X-Files? Oh Lord. Well, the X Factor. Although the X-Files is coming back. This is very exciting. March, Channel 5, yay. Sorry, showing my age. So, you know, staying in to watch the X Factor, going out at the weekends to spend their money on shoes. How are the young women engaged in activism different from that? Well, they're not entirely. You know, the young women that I interviewed quite liked shoes in a lot of ways. There were some differences. One of them was talking a lot about her cherry red Doc Martens and how she doesn't wear them if she's going on big protests because she doesn't want them to get scuffed and ruined. And she particularly is a bit worried that if she gets arrested, then they might get confiscated and she might never get them back. So still worried about shoes, maybe slightly different kind of orientation of those concerns. But one of the most important things I found from talking to these amazing, inspiring young women who are engaged in a really broad range of political and social activism is that what makes a difference is the installation of attitudes in young women that make them predisposed to engage in politics. And so in sociology we talk a lot about political socialisation, the process by which young people learn how to become political and how to engage in political processes. And a lot of the material is very dull, and it takes quite a top-down approach. Young people are seen as empty vessels that need to be filled up with information. And that's kind of problematic because it assumes that young people and children are ignorant. It assumes that they don't understand the political world and they need teaching. And while yes, they may need informing about certain complex parliamentary procedures, really what they need is to have instilled in them a worldview that encourages a sense of political capacity and political concern. So what I found with the young women that I'd been interviewing was that they had instilled in them from a young age some really important ideas about empathy, about refusing to tolerate injustice, about concern for others, about a sense of fairness. And anyone who's met, particularly young children, you'll know that they have a really serious, intense sense of fairness and unfairness. And predominantly that's often, you know, kind of quite personalised. Well, they got a toy and I didn't. That's not fair. But that can be broadened out very easily. It doesn't like being ignored. There we go. That can be broadened out very easily to encourage young people to take that sense of what is fair and apply it to the wider world. To apply it to the fact that some people have money and some people don't. To the fact that some people's lives are very easy and some people's aren't. And so Jodie, check the flow. So Jodie was one of the young women that I interviewed. Fascinating young woman who'd actually been to prison for the activism that she'd been engaged in. And she grew up very poor, very working class, and experienced a lot of disadvantage. Daughter of a single mother. One of the most important things for her in her, really early developmental stages as a young woman thinking about the world was the example set to her by her mother. And the impression that her mother gave to her that the world isn't fair, but we should really think about doing something about it. And that sense of compassion stayed with her and motivated her to start questioning the inequalities that she experienced. So she said, talking about her mother, she's very compassionate and aware. Like, if we're walking down the street and she's got £5 left in the world, she'll still give £1 to a homeless guy. So to have that influence from her, that also made my view of the world a lot more heightened. It didn't brush over the pain and the difficulty that the inequalities in the world bring up. It encouraged her to confront it head on and to see it as something that she was capable of changing. So that compassion, that empathy, that orientation to social justice came through really strongly in the conversations that I had with these young women. And importantly, a refusal to tolerate it. But there's a gap between looking at the world and thinking it's unfair and then deciding to do something about it. So what creates these young women who take to public spaces to express their dissent, to attempt to effect change? There's a necessary it's necessary for these ideas of kind of fairness, empathy, compassion to exist. But there's an added element that's needed there, and it's something else that we need to instill in young people, and that's a sense of efficacy, a sense of potential to effect change, an ability to act, and an entitlement to act, particularly for young women, to take up space and demand change. So, thinking back to political socialisation theory, which I won't bore you with extensively, but a large part of it focuses on primary socialisation, the socialisation that occurs and is passed down from predominantly parents and guardians, the people who have the formative kind of influences in young people's lives. And that's not surprising. They're the ones that spend most of their time with their children. They're the first ones to kind of impart their ideas. But again, this isn't a question of telling children that they need to vote and who they should vote for, or kind of taking them to meet their MP necessarily. It's more about the messages that we can give to children about their responsibility to act, and that they, particularly as young women, have the capacity to act. So this can be as simple as talking to young people about issues, about encouraging them to watch the news. When they come home and ask difficult questions, rather than brushing them off, to engage them in those questions, and not necessarily having all the answers. We don't need to be able to kind of tell children why, we can fix this, or how this goes wrong. But it's developing the skills that they need to believe that they can find the answers, and that they can work, particularly with other people, towards the answers. Something that I'll come back to in a minute, but I want to kind of raise here because parents, and particularly mothers, are particularly important for this, are the way in which the family is a really important space for challenging gender norms, and the potential that that has for developing the sense of efficacy that girls and young women need. Because too often in society, girls are told that what's important is to be pretty, is to be demure, is to be feminine, is to help other people but not take too much credit for it, to care for people but not to expect anything in return, to please people. And with these ideas of kind of the boring, tired ideas of traditional femininity, come the very things that stop women from participating. It's about being quiet. It's about not taking up too much space. It's about not challenging anyone for fear that you'll upset them. And those are things that hold women back from feeling entitled to have opinions, to take up space, to demand change. And so parents who engage in progressive forms of gender socialisation, of teaching girls and boys that there are different ways of being male or female or other or something in between. That they can be strong if they're girls, that they can cry if they're boys, to break down those binaries between male and female that cause so many of the problems that we experience in society. That's the power that parents have and guardians have. So Sam was one of my participants who was just in her last year of university when I spoke to her. And she was engaged in quite a broad range of political organisations, student activism, socialist and anarchist activism, stuff around veganism. And she had quite an interesting background because her family setup was different than a lot of kind of normative ideas of families. And there was a bit of a gender reversal that had gone on with her parents because of their situation. And her dad had stayed at home for a quite significant part of her childhood, and her mum was the main breadwinner. And this remains a relatively unusual family form, but is increasingly becoming more common. But what that meant for her is that she was aware that things could be done differently. And it opened up spaces for conversations about what men and women do. So she said, when I was really young, Dad stayed at home and looked after us, and Mum went out to work. So we had conversations about that. And my mum had a lot more control over the household. So I think I always subconsciously believed in the equality of men and women, but didn't actualise it until I learned what that word meant. So she's talking about feminism. And in a lot of the conversations that I had with these young women, feminism was a really important part of their identity, and I'll come back to that later. But what was interesting about their experiences of feminism was that they didn't name them for a very long time. They often didn't come to label themselves or kind of embrace the identity of feminist until their teenage or early 20s. And yet they had lived lives that had engaged with feminism, and they had a fundamental commitment to gender equality, even if they weren't sure that there was a word for it. And that was hugely important because it shaped their understanding of their relationships with men, and their understanding of their relationships as women who can maybe do things, that they're not restricted by their femininity, by their traditional roles that sometimes people try to enforce on them. It encouraged them to challenge instances of sexism that told them to be quiet, that told them to sit down and not interrupt, that told them not to challenge things because it might, upset people. So parents can have a huge influence in developing young women's understandings of politics, even when politics, that big formal institution that predominantly kind of exists in London, in Parliament, that can be broadened out for young people by just engaging them with topics that speak to their sense of fairness and justice. So the second group of people who were really important in a lot of the young women I interviewed's lives were a group of people who I have come to term significant mothers. They weren't all women, but they predominantly were. And they were largely older women in those girls' and young women's lives. People like aunts, friends of parents, particularly friends of mothers, other friends' mothers. They were older women who served as role models. But what was particularly interesting is that they weren't necessarily role models in terms of political practice. So these weren't necessarily women who were politicians, on local government or on a larger scale. They weren't necessarily activists, but they were women who showed these girls that there were a multiplicity of ways to be a woman, and that they didn't need to be constrained by traditional ideas of femininity that might hold them back. So there's a lot of work that's been done on what academics call other mothers, in particularly African Caribbean communities, where there is a natural kind of multi- or intergenerational network of women in these young women's lives. And it's a network that they rely on for support, for guidance, for encouragement, and it's massively important. A lot of the research talks about the way in which it can prevent young women from going down the wrong path. It can prevent early pregnancy or engagement in crime. But the women that my interviewees talked about, it was a sense of, I can grow up to be a woman like that. I can grow up to do all of the things that those women do. And obviously, a lot of their mothers, were role models as well. But it was important that there was a multiplicity of these women. And so there were examples of different ways of engaging with the world. And at times when their own mothers failed or were weak, so Jodie, for example, spoke about the way in which her mother experienced mental health problems for a significant part of her childhood, and so wasn't always able to give her that strong kind of ideal of a woman. Other women stepped in and shared the burden. So that idea that it takes a village to raise a child, it can seem kind of trite at times, but older women are massively important in girls' lives. And if you know young women, be those role models for them. So Catherine was interesting. She was a brilliant woman. You stood in awe of her. But she told me a really interesting story of the way in which a woman that she knew made her want to be the woman that she is now. And again, it wasn't about activism. This woman wasn't kind of barricading herself to the gates of coal mines, as Catherine now sometimes is prone to. And does it very well. Instead, this woman actually, kind of was quite normal. But there was one special thing about this woman. This woman loved horses. And Catherine, as a young girl, loved horses, because horses! And so this woman taught her to ride. But this was a woman who, with her horse, would go off around the country for about 3 months every year and just travel around. She'd pack up all the bags, put them on a horse, and they'd walk and they'd ride. And they would go for weeks. And Catherine thought this was amazing, because she'd never before thought that it was safe for a woman to be out in the world on their own for that length of time, because bad things might happen. And that's the phrase she used, bad things would happen. And this woman showed her that actually it's possible to inhabit the natural world particularly. And this is one of the roots of Catherine's kind of interest in environmental politics. And so she said, the woman who taught me to ride horses when I was a teenager loved the natural environment and taught us to love it and spent a lot of time out in it. And she's a strong woman with no male characters in her life. And I think that sort of role model is really important for young women and drastically missing for a lot of young people. So she really changed my life. So being an example, not necessarily of political engagement, but of a way to be in the world that is empowered, that's independent, that's forthright. Those are the characteristics that young women who come to engage in politics need at quite a formative age. And I think what's interesting is that now Catherine is being that woman to other girls and young women. So this is something that carries on. So finally, the third group that I want to talk about is perhaps one of the kind of more obvious ones, the idea of friends, peer group. The people that particularly girls in their teenage years spend an awful lot of time with. But peers in the sociological literature are really interesting because peer influence is predominantly spoken out of in really negative terms. Peer groups get people taking drugs. Peer groups get people having sex too young. Peer groups get people engaged in crime and smoking and drinking. And they're largely seen as an area for concern. Damn those young people and all their drinking and smoking and taking drugs and having sex. We never did that when we were young. Oh wait, hang on. Yeah. But peer influence is hugely important when you think about the amount of time that people spend with their friends, even in, as grown-ups. But particularly as teenagers, and peer groups can be fundamental in shaping young people's identities. But this research showed that peer groups can be massively productive and influential and empowering. Particularly because it's all very well having older women showing you how amazing it is to be a woman. But when you're an awkward teenage girl, that can seem so far off. It seems like you're never going to get there, you're never going to get that independence, you're never going to get that confidence because you kind of hate yourself because you're a teenager, of course you do, it's horrible. But you can't see beyond that a lot. But if you have peers who boost you up, who encourage you, who validate the things that you're doing, that can be hugely important. It normalises what are otherwise seen as exceptional behaviours or deviant behaviours. So political participation in all of its myriad forms can be encouraged by promoted by, instigated by peers. I'm gripping this slightly too hard. Peers served as kind of an important point throughout young women's lives and continue to. So while parents tended to have their formative kind of influence in people's childhoods, peers continue to be important, right up until the present day and beyond. So whether it's one of the young women I talked to, she had a friend at school and she described her as being really bright and really cool and kind of really political. And she used that kind of slightly affected teenage voice to try and convey the way in which she was slightly in awe of her because she was awesome. And so while young women look up to older women, they can also look up to their friends of the same age. And they can be inspired to try and do the same sorts of things. Naomi talks about her experience at university. So again, we're going beyond kind of childhood into young adulthood and looking at the influence of peers. And there were two people in particular, one boy, one girl, or one young man, one young woman. And so two particular characters have a lot to answer for. And they're two of my very best friends. And they set up an environmental society. And they both come from more radical backgrounds. And they set up an environmental society at university. And we got involved, and we started just doing things, like trying to stop car parks being built. So, those young people who, you know, are lucky enough to have radical parents who take them out on marches, who get them selling kind of political badges or newspapers, or, you know, take them to talks or protests, like, that's brilliant. But most of the young women that I talked to didn't have parents like that. There were a couple, but the vast majority had very normal childhoods, quite conservative at times childhoods. But they often met friends who'd been lucky enough to be in that position. And that's then spread beyond that single child's experience to influencing other young people and encouraging them to participate and telling them they could participate, that this was possible. And it's the idea of this being possible that was so important to the young women in my study. Another case was a young woman who, with a group of her friends, when the Iraq War started, staged a walkout at her school. And there were a series, for those of you who remember, there were a series of walkouts all around the country. And thousands of young people walked out of school on strike at the idea of engaging in an unjust war. And so with her group of friends banding together and feeling like they were powerful, they wrote letters to their head teacher. They wrote letters to the police and they said, we are going. And they did. And it's often the case that, you know, at a relatively young age, you don't necessarily have the confidence to do these things yourself, on your own. But if there's a group of you, if there's that solidarity amongst friends, the power becomes greater and you feel like you can do more. And that's what all of these three groups have done. They have empowered young women. And so when we talk about political socialisation, we talk about, you know, teaching young people how to do stuff. But what we should be talking about is developing young people's agency. Getting them to understand that they can act, that they have the capacity to affect change. And that agency is relational. It's developed through the relationships that they have with significant people in their lives who can support them to do that. And that in turn, they can then go on to become the significant person in other people's lives. So one last kind of point of interest. A lot of the time, during my PhD, when I brought up what I was doing and I explained my research, there'd always be someone, usually a man, funny enough, who go, but what about boys? Why aren't you looking at young men's political participation? And it's a fair question, you know, there are definitely PhDs to be written about young men's political participation. But there are also plenty of books that already have been written about young men's political participation, because that's seen as normal. Politics, if we take it as in a parliamentary sense, or even largely kind of in an activist sense, a trade union sense, politics is far too often seen as the preserve of men. It's the thing that they are encouraged to do, they feel capable of doing, they have the skills of kind of public speaking to do, and that's great, and we need that. But we need to recognise that politics is a gendered sphere, and that gender influences people's sense of capacity and agency. And in particular, young women are often held back by what is perceived as kind of appropriate for girls to be engaged in. And obviously, you know, I'm having a nice, lovely write-on audience, you're like, that's terrible. Rise up, women. Yes, that's what we need. But in order to do that, we need to recognise that there are certain barriers that affect young women's participation that young men don't necessarily encounter. And so, if we're looking to see how we can encourage young women to be more active, we need to focus on that and think, okay, this isn't just straightforward. It's not just a case of they need to do what all the boys are doing. But beyond that, gender's interesting for young women's participation because it links to ideas of sexism, gender injustice, and, you know, the solution to all these things, yay, feminism. So, I mentioned earlier that feminism was something that kind of ran through the narratives and the stories that these young women told. But it was something that they didn't necessarily label until later in life. Often not until they got to university and studied it in some form. So I interviewed 20 people, 19 of them had done a degree that was in some ways kind of social science, arts or humanities. So kind of the sorts of subjects where you're most likely to encounter some form of feminist critique. And it's feminism that was at the heart of a lot of their identities. They saw themselves as activists, as environmentalists, as anarchists, but those were all integrated with feminism. And feminism was often what drove their engagement and influenced the way in which they engaged. So Zoe talked about growing up with a single mother, but living with not just her mum, but her grandmother. And they would often talk about, or just kind of develop an awareness around injustice relating to being poor and working class, but also to being female, and the fact that they had experienced sexism, and particularly that they'd experienced domestic violence. And for her, it really helped her to develop a joint kind of political identity as a socialist, but also as a feminist, and that those two things were massively important together, that there was an intersectional identity. And I think her quote is really useful for helping us to think about the sort of politics that we want, if we want a new form of politics. And she says there's an us and them antagonism that both maps onto men and women, and also maps onto haves and have-nots. So this sense of injustice or unfairness was something that she noticed between men and women, but she also noticed it between, you know, the poor and the rich, the powerful and the not powerful. And so she lives and she embodies a politics that is committed to an intersectional form of justice, that doesn't just seek to effect change for a certain group of people, but seeks to effect a wide-ranging, overarching change that is empowering to everyone and that challenges those entrenched forms of privilege that not only make people's lives difficult and painful, but also make engaging in politics difficult and painful. And so there's a whole other talk here to do about the way in which social movement politics and activism remains hugely problematic. problematic in terms of gender. It remains hugely sexist. there are 2 chapters in my thesis that are all about the sexism that young women continue to experience in their political organising. The sexual violence that still takes place within radical communities. The dismissal of women's opinions and concerns. The fact that police violence and state violence is considered more serious and more worthy of action than domestic violence. All of these are about gender and politics, and all of them are things that need addressing if our social movements are to be effective and to actually achieve something and create that change that we want. But we have to think about how politics is gendered, and also how there is an important aspect of gender in getting women to feel like there are things that they can do. To getting women to feel like they are agents of change. So I leave you with that. I leave you with the idea that if the world is going to be a better place, politics can't stay the same. And that one of the most important things that we need to do is to empower the young women that we know and the young women that we encounter to feel like they have the right to take action. They have the capacity to affect change, and that we're going to help them do it.